She was handcuffed over a stale loaf of sourdough. A woman who weighed 240 pounds, shoved against the flashing lights of a squad car while the neighborhood watched. The cops called her a thief. The media called her a desperate criminal. But they didn't know the bread was a setup, and they certainly didn't know that Victor Marino, the most ruthless crime boss in the city, was watching from his tinted Maybach, and he was furious. The neon sign of O'Malley's diner flickered with a persistent, annoying buzz, casting a harsh pink glow over the wet pavement of West Taylor Street. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee, old fryer grease, and the distinct, lingering smell of exhaustion. Chloe Dempsey wiped down the laminate counter for the 4th time that hour. She was a big woman, unapologetically fat, carrying 240 pounds on a 5'5" frame. Her faded yellow uniform stretched tightly across her broad hips and thick thighs, the fabric pulling at the buttons across her full bust. Her feet, crammed into worn-out white sneakers, throbbed with a dull, relentless ache that had long since settled deep into her bones. At 28, Chloe was used to the invisibility that came with her size. To most of the late-night patrons, she was just part of the furniture, a soft, round fixture who kept their coffee mugs full and endured their dismissive attitudes. Her manager, Todd, a balding man with a perpetual sneer, never missed an opportunity to make a snide remark about her weight, usually suggesting she was eating into the diner's profits. But Chloe endured it. She had rent to pay, and the elderly neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Higgins, relied on Chloe to help feed her 2 young grandchildren. The diner bell chimed at exactly 1:15 a.m. Victor Marino stepped out of the freezing Chicago rain and into the diner, bringing an immediate heavy shift in the atmosphere. He did not belong in a place like O'Malley's. He was dressed in a bespoke charcoal Italian suit that probably cost more than Chloe made in 3 years. His dark overcoat was completely dry, suggesting he hadn't walked more than 2 steps from a luxury vehicle. He had sharp, aristocratic features, piercing dark eyes, and a quiet, terrifying stillness about him. Victor was the head of the Marino Syndicate, a man who controlled the city's underground ports, the unions, and the politicians. He slid into the corner booth, his eyes immediately finding Chloe. Victor hated the superficial world he inhabited. The women in his circle were sharp edges, plastic surgery, and hollow ambitions. They were dangerous and calculating. But Chloe. Victor had been coming to O'Malley's every Tuesday night for a month just to watch her. He saw the way she moved, the gentle simple sway of her wide hips, the genuine warmth in her smile when she handed a homeless man a free cup of soup out the back door. He found her physical softness utterly intoxicating. She was real. She was a woman who knew hardship, yet her spirit remained entirely unbroken. "Just the usual black coffee, sir?" Chloe asked, approaching his table with a warm, if slightly tired, smile. She felt a strange flutter in her chest whenever this man came in. He was intensely handsome, but it was the way he looked at her that unsettled her. He didn't look through her. He looked at her. "Yes, Chloe." "Thank you," Victor said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that sent a shiver down her spine. He always remembered her name. She poured his coffee, her hand trembling slightly as his dark eyes tracked her movements. "Can I get you anything else? We have a fresh cherry pie." "Well, as fresh as it gets at 1 in the morning." "No, just the coffee," Victor replied softly. "You look exhausted. You should be off your feet." Chloe let out a breathless, self-deprecating laugh, subconsciously smoothing her hands over her prominent stomach. "Rest doesn't pay the heating bill, unfortunately. Enjoy your coffee." 30 minutes later, Victor left a crisp $100 bill under his saucer and walked out into the night. At 2 a.m., Chloe finally clocked out. She wrapped her thick, knitted scarf around her neck, bracing herself for the bitter wind. Before heading to the bus stop, she walked down the narrow alley behind the diner. Next door was Pendleton's Artisan Bakery. Every night, the owner, Arthur Pendleton, left a black crate of day-old bread by the back door for the local shelter to pick up in the morning. For the past year, Chloe had quietly taken a single loaf twice a week for Mrs. Higgins's grandchildren. Arthur had caught her once and told her he didn't care, as long as she didn't make a mess. Tonight, the alley was pitch black. The street lamp at the corner had been shattered. Chloe waddled heavily toward the crate, her breath misting in the cold air. She reached into the plastic bin and pulled out a heavy, wax paper-wrapped loaf of sourdough. It felt unusually dense, almost rock-hard in the center, but she figured it was just horribly stale. Before she could even turn around, the blinding beams of high-powered tactical flashlights hit her face. "Drop it! Put your hands in the air, right now!" a harsh voice barked. Chloe gasped, dropping the loaf. It hit the pavement with a bizarre, heavy clunk. 3 police officers rushed her from the shadows. Before she could process what was happening, rough hands grabbed her shoulders, spinning her around and slamming her chest first against the damp brick wall of the bakery. The impact knocked the wind out of her lungs. "What are you doing? I didn't do anything!" Chloe cried out, her voice trembling in terror. "Shut up, thief!" Officer Jenkins sneered, yanking her arms behind her back. Chloe whimpered in pain. Her arms were thick and her shoulders weren't flexible. "Cuffs won't close on these wrists. Get the zip ties," Jenkins barked to his partner. They bound her wrists with brutal plastic ties that immediately cut into her skin. They dragged her out of the alley and toward a waiting squad car. Neighbors in the adjacent apartment building were already opening their windows, their cell phones out, recording the fat waitress being hauled away like a violent felon over a loaf of bread. Parked across the street, idling silently in the shadows, was a black Maybach. Inside the plush leather interior, Victor Marino watched the entire scene unfold. His jaw clenched so tight, a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. He watched the officers shove Chloe's soft, trembling body into the back of the cruiser. "Leo," Victor said, his voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. His right-hand man, sitting in the driver's seat, adjusted his rear-view mirror. "Yes, boss. Find out who called those cops. Find out why a patrol unit was waiting in an abandoned alley for a waitress, and call the precinct. If anyone lays another finger on her, I will burn the building to the ground with them inside." The holding cell at the 12th precinct smelled of ammonia, stale sweat, and despair. Chloe sat on the edge of the metal bench, her knees pressed tightly together, trying to make herself as small as possible. It was an impossible task. Her large body took up space, and the freezing metal dug painfully into her thick thighs through her thin uniform. Tears streamed silently down her round cheeks, washing away her cheap mascara. She had been processed like a hardened criminal. They had taken her shoelaces, her scarf, and her dignity. When she had asked for a glass of water, the booking sergeant had merely laughed. "Big girl like you shouldn't be stealing carbs anyway. Consider this a diet," he had mocked. The humiliation burned hotter than the physical pain of the deep red welts left on her wrists by the zip ties. Why was this happening? It was just bread. Arthur Pendleton had given her permission. But when the police brought her in, they didn't charge her with petty theft. They charged her with grand larceny and possession of stolen property, with intent to distribute. Chloe didn't understand the legal jargon, but she understood the 20-year minimum sentence the smirking detective had threatened her with. Across the city, Victor Marino was tearing apart the fabric of the neighborhood to find the truth. Inside the Maybach, Leo handed Victor a glowing iPad. "Boss, you were right. It wasn't a random bust. We got a hold of Arthur Pendleton. We didn't even have to break any bones. The coward started talking the second we walked into his bakery." Victor didn't look up from the screen. "And? Pendleton's bakery is a front," Leo explained, his tone strictly professional. "He washes money for the Russian syndicate on the south side. But tonight wasn't about cash. That loaf of sourdough Chloe picked up? It was a hollowed-out dead drop. Inside was a waterproof vault containing a ledger on a USB drive, plus $3 million in untraceable bearer bonds." Victor's eyes darkened. "And the cops?" "Dirty," Leo confirmed. "Officer Jenkins and his crew work for the Russians. They were supposed to intercept the drop tonight to ensure it safely reached their boss. But they were late. Chloe got to the crate first. When the cops rolled up and saw her with the bread, they panicked. They couldn't just shoot her in the alley. Too many witnesses. Too messy. So they arrested her under the guise of theft, planning to quietly confiscate the evidence and toss her in general population where she'd likely be taken out to tie up loose ends." A terrifying silence filled the car. Victor Marino was not a man prone to explosive tantrums. His anger was absolute zero. It froze everything it touched. "They used her," Victor said quietly. "They humiliated an innocent woman, put their filthy hands on her, and planned to let her die in a cage, all to cover their own incompetence." "Yes, boss. The precinct is processing her transfer to county jail in an hour. Once she's on that transport bus, the Russians have guards on the inside who will make sure she doesn't survive the night." "Turn the car around," Victor commanded. "We are going to the 12th precinct." "Boss, walking into a police station." "I said, drive." At 3:45 a.m., the front doors of the 12th precinct swung open. The usual chaotic din of ringing phones, shouting officers, and crying suspects instantly died down. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. Victor Marino walked in, flanked by Leo and 3 other men in immaculate suits. The officers in the room froze. Some instinctively rested their hands on their holstered weapons, but nobody drew. You didn't draw a gun on Victor Marino unless you wanted an all-out war that you would inevitably lose. Victor bypassed the front desk entirely and walked straight toward the holding area. Captain Donovan, a heavy-set man with a red face and a receding hairline, rushed out of his office, his badge bouncing against his chest. "Marino, you can't be back here. What the hell do you think you're doing?" Donovan barked, though his voice lacked any real authority. It was laced with panic. Victor stopped slowly. He turned his head to look at Donovan, his eyes dead and unfeeling. "Captain Donovan, you are currently holding a woman named Chloe Dempsey. I am here to take her home. She's a suspect in a major felony investigation," Donovan stammered, wiping sweat from his brow. "You know I can't just release a prisoner to you. She took a piece of garbage from an alley," Victor interrupted, his voice low enough to force everyone in the room to lean in to hear it. "But the men who arrested her, Jenkins and his partners, they didn't log the evidence, did they? They took the loaf of bread, cracked it open, and pocketed the bonds. They stole from the Russians, Donovan, and they used your precinct to do it." Donovan's face went completely pale. "What are you talking about?" "Check Jenkins's locker," Victor said smoothly. "My men made sure to leave an anonymous tip with Internal Affairs 5 minutes ago. They should be arriving shortly. Now you have 2 choices, Captain. You release Chloe Dempsey into my custody right now, and all charges disappear as a clerical error. Or I let the Russians know that your officers stole their $3 million, and I let you deal with the fallout when they burn your homes down." Donovan swallowed hard. He looked at the holding cell, then back at Victor. He nodded sharply to the desk sergeant. "Get the keys. Let the girl out." Inside the cell, Chloe heard the heavy clatter of boots approaching. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing herself for the worst. The heavy iron door groaned open. "Come on, Dempsey. You're out," a guard muttered. Chloe blinked, confused. She pushed her heavy body up from the bench, her legs numb and shaking. She stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. And there he was. Victor Marino stood at the end of the corridor. When he saw her, her stained uniform, her tear-streaked face, the brutal red marks on her wrists, something dark and violent shattered behind his eyes. But he didn't show it. Instead, he took off his expensive charcoal overcoat and walked toward her. "Victor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What are you doing here?" Without a word, Victor wrapped the heavy, warm coat around her trembling shoulders. The scent of cedar and expensive cologne enveloped her. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently taking her bruised wrists, inspecting the damage with a jaw set in stone. "I'm taking you home, Chloe," he said softly, his thumbs brushing lightly over her skin. "No one will ever touch you again. I promise you that." The rain lashed aggressively against the heavily tinted, bulletproof windows of the Maybach S-Class as it glided away from the 12th precinct. Inside the cavernous rear cabin, the atmosphere was thick with an unsaid tension. Chloe sat frozen against the pristine cream leather upholstery, her large frame completely swallowed by Victor's heavy charcoal overcoat. She clutched the lapels together with her aching hands, staring blankly at the mahogany trim on the door panel. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had spent her entire adult life trying to go unnoticed, apologizing for the space her 240 pounds occupied in the world. Yet sitting beside this quiet, terrifyingly powerful man, she felt entirely seen. Victor reached over to the small built-in crystal decanter console nestled between their seats. He poured a small measure of amber liquid into a heavy tumbler and held it out to her. "Drink this. It's Macallan, 25 years old. It will help stop the shaking." Chloe hesitated, looking at his large, perfectly manicured hand before taking the glass. Her thick, bruised fingers brushed against his knuckles, sending a jolt of static electricity up her arm. She brought the glass to her lips and swallowed. The expensive scotch burned a fiery trail down her throat, settling into a heavy warmth in her stomach. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a raspy whisper. Captains don't just let suspects walk out of holding cells. They don't sweat like that unless they think they're going to die. Victor kept his gaze locked on her, his dark eyes entirely devoid of the coldness he had shown the police. "My name is Victor Marino. I run certain enterprises in this city. The men who arrested you tonight were not acting as police officers. They were acting as thieves for a rival organization. They used you as a scapegoat." Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill. "Because of the bread? Arthur's stale sourdough." "It wasn't bread," Victor corrected gently. "It was a dead drop, a hollowed-out shell containing $3 million in untraceable bearer bonds and a digital ledger belonging to the Russian syndicate." "Grigory Volkov's money," Chloe gasped, her eyes snapping open. She pressed back into the seat, her broad chest heaving as the reality of the situation crashed over her. "Oh my God! $3 million! They're going to kill me! If the police don't put me in a cage, this Volkov person will kill me." "No one is going to touch you," Victor said, his tone carrying a frightening, absolute certainty. You are under my protection now, Chloe. Volkov will have to burn the entire city of Chicago to the ground before he gets within 100 yards of you. The Maybach smoothly navigated onto Lakeshore Drive, heading toward the affluent Gold Coast neighborhood. They pulled into the subterranean parking garage of a towering, ultra-luxury high-rise. Leo, who had driven the entire way in stony silence, opened the door. Victor guided Chloe toward a private biometric elevator. When the doors parted on the penthouse level, Chloe stepped into a world she had only seen in glossy magazines. The sprawling apartment featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the turbulent, dark expanse of Lake Michigan. The floors were polished, dark walnut, adorned with genuine Persian silk rugs. It was a fortress wrapped in devastating luxury. "Sit on the sofa," Victor instructed, gesturing to a massive, curved velvet sectional. "My private physician is already on his way." Within 10 minutes, Dr. Samuel Beck, a discreet, grey-haired man carrying a black leather medical bag, arrived. He didn't ask questions. He simply cleaned the deep, red abrasions around Chloe's thick wrists, applying a soothing antiseptic ointment and wrapping them in sterile gauze. "No permanent nerve damage," Dr. Beck murmured to Victor, packing up his supplies. "She needs rest, hydration, and a safe environment to come down from the adrenaline spike." After the doctor left, Victor walked back into the living room. Chloe was still sitting rigidly on the edge of the velvet sofa. She felt absurdly out of place, a heavy, exhausted diner waitress trespassing in a billionaire's sanctuary. "I had my housekeeper prepare the guest suite," Victor said, his voice dropping to a softer register as he approached her. He knelt in front of her, uncaring that his $1,000 suit trousers were brushing the floor. "There are fresh clothes in the bathroom. Take a hot shower. Sleep." Chloe looked down at him, her defenses finally crumbling. "Why are you doing this, Victor? You don't owe me anything. I just pour your coffee." Victor reached up, his hand gently cupping her soft, round cheek. His thumb brushed away a lingering tear. "You are the only real thing in my world, Chloe. I have watched you give away the little you have to people who have nothing. I have watched you endure a life that is relentlessly cruel, and yet you remain kind. I will not let these monsters destroy you to cover their own greed." His gaze dropped momentarily to her full lips, a flicker of raw, possessive heat flashing in his dark eyes before he pulled his hand away and stood up. "Rest now. We have a war to plan tomorrow." Chloe woke up to the soft, golden light of morning filtering through sheer silk drapes. For a long, disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The mattress beneath her was like a cloud, draped in ultra-luxurious fret linens that felt like cool water against her skin. Then the dull throb in her bandaged wrists brought the terrifying memories of the alley, the flashing red and blue lights, and the holding cell rushing back. She pushed herself up, the heavy duvet pooling around her wide hips. The guest suite was massive, decorated in muted tones of slate and ivory. Slowly, she swung her thick legs over the side of the bed and padded toward the ensuite bathroom. It was a masterpiece of white Carrara marble, featuring a massive soaking tub equipped with Perrin and Rowe brass fixtures. Sitting on the marble vanity was a neat stack of clothing. Chloe frowned. Usually people with money had no concept of plus-size bodies. They thought offering a large t-shirt was enough, but as she unfolded the garments, she realized someone had gone to astonishing lengths. There was a dark emerald green silk wrap dress from Marina Rinaldi, a high-end designer brand that catered exclusively to curvy women. Beneath it was a set of incredibly soft, supportive undergarments that looked perfectly tailored to her exact measurements. She showered, letting the steaming water wash away the smell of the precinct and the diner fryer grease. When she slipped into the green wrap dress, she stared at herself in the massive, fog-free mirror. The rich color complemented her pale skin, and the cut of the fabric cinched perfectly at her waist, elegantly draping over her heavy stomach and full hips. She looked beautiful. She looked powerful. Taking a deep breath, she walked out of the suite and followed the rich aroma of dark roasted coffee down the sweeping hallway. Victor was sitting at a massive live-edge oak dining table, reviewing a stack of dossiers. He was dressed in a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faded ink. When he heard her approach, he looked up. The air seemed to catch in his throat. He set his pen down, his eyes slowly traveling over her curves, lingering on the soft swell of her breasts and the wide, feminine flare of her hips. "You look breathtaking," Victor said, his voice a low rumble that made her toes curl into the plush rug. "Thank you," Chloe replied, her cheeks flushing hot. She sat down opposite him. "How did you know my size?" "I am a man who pays attention to details," Victor answered simply. He poured her a cup of coffee and slid a plate of fresh fruit and artisanal pastries toward her. "Eat. You need your strength." Chloe took a small bite of a buttery croissant, though her stomach was tied in knots. "What happens now? I can't hide in this penthouse forever. I have to go to work. I have to check on Mrs. Higgins and her grandkids." Victor's expression hardened, the warmth draining from his face to be replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a mob boss. "You no longer work at O'Malley's diner, and you cannot go back to your apartment." "What? You can't just dictate my life," Chloe protested, her voice rising in manic. "I am trying to save your life," Victor corrected firmly. He picked up a remote and pressed a button. A massive flat-screen television on the far wall flared to life, displaying the local morning news. The screen showed a live shot of West Taylor Street. The entire block was cordoned off with yellow police tape. Where O'Malley's diner had stood just hours ago, there was now only a smoldering, blackened crater. Firefighters were still hosing down the charred remnants of the neon sign. Chloe gasped, dropping her croissant. She covered her mouth with both hands, tears instantly welling in her eyes. "Grigory Volkov's men paid a visit to your manager, Todd, early this morning," Victor explained, his voice devoid of emotion. "They were looking for you, and they were looking for the ledger. When Todd couldn't give them answers, they locked him in the walk-in freezer and torched the building." "Todd," Chloe sobbed, her heavy shoulders shaking. "Is he—" "He survived. The fire department got him out in time, but he is in intensive care," Victor Hoyer said. He leaned forward, resting his large hands on the table. "They also raided your apartment building. They kicked down your door." "Mrs. Higgins!" Chloe shrieked, half standing from her chair, sheer terror gripping her heart. "Is completely safe," Victor interrupted quickly, raising a hand to placate her. "I anticipated Volkov's moves. My men intercepted the threat. Before the Russians even reached your floor, Leo had already evacuated Mrs. Higgins and her grandchildren. They are currently staying in a 5-star hotel in Schaumburg, under an assumed name, with a fully paid expense account and 2 of my best guards stationed outside their door." Chloe collapsed back into her chair, a profound wave of relief washing over her, immediately followed by a crushing sense of guilt. "This is all my fault, because I took that stupid bread." Victor stood up, rounding the table until he was standing right beside her. He reached down, pulling her up from the chair. Despite her weight, he hauled her into his chest with effortless strength. He wrapped his arms around her thick waist, burying his face in her hair. "None of this is your fault," Victor murmured fiercely against her ear. "You are innocent in a world run by wolves. But Volkov made a fatal mistake last night. He brought you into the crossfire, which means he brought my wrath down upon his entire empire." Chloe looked up into his dark, dangerous eyes, realizing just how deep into the underworld she had fallen. And heaven help her, wrapped in the arms of the city's most feared mafia don, it was the safest she had ever felt. The afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the heavy, charcoal-grey clouds hanging over Chicago, casting a permanent twilight over the city. Inside the fortress-like sanctuary of the penthouse, the silence was agonizing. Victor had left 3 hours ago, flanked by Leo and heavily armed men dressed in immaculate suits. Before leaving, he had kissed the crown of Chloe's head, an impossibly tender gesture from a man whose hands were built for violence, and promised he would return before nightfall. Chloe paced the length of the massive living room. Her bare feet sank into the plush Persian rug, the emerald silk of her wrap dress swishing around her thick calves. She felt restless, her large body thrumming with unspent anxious energy. Dominic, a towering mountain of a man with a jagged scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stood silently by the main elevator bank. He was Victor's chief of personal security, and he hadn't blinked or moved a muscle in over an hour. "Would you like something to eat, Miss Dempsey?" Dominic suddenly asked, his voice surprisingly soft for a man who looked like a professional hitman. "Mr. Marino gave explicit instructions that you are to be kept comfortable." "I couldn't possibly eat," Chloe murmured, wrapping her thick arms around her waist, highly self-conscious of her prominent stomach. "Do you know where he went, Dominic? Please, I need to know what is happening." Dominic hesitated, his dark eyes softening a fraction. "The boss is at the commercial ports on the south side. He is having a conversation with one of Grigory Volkov's lieutenants. It is not a place for a lady to worry about." Down at the freezing, rain-slicked docks, Victor Marino was entirely devoid of the gentle warmth he reserved solely for Chloe. The massive steel doors of Warehouse 4 were bolted shut from the inside. In the center of the cavernous, dimly lit space, a man was strapped to a heavy iron chair. Dmitri, Volkov's head of distribution, looked terrified. His designer clothes were soaked with icy water, his face bruised and bloody from Leo's introductory questioning. Victor stood a few feet away, meticulously unbuttoning his suit jacket. He handed it to Leo, without taking his eyes off the trembling Russian. "I am only going to ask you this one time, Dmitri," Victor said, his voice a low, lethal baritone that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. "Where is the USB drive? The ledger that your men foolishly lost in a bakery alley?" "I swear, Marino, I don't have it," Dmitri spat, blood trailing from his split lip. "Jenkins and his dirty cops, they took it. They tried to fence the bearer bonds this morning, but my boss found out. We torched the diner looking for the girl, but we never recovered the drive." Victor's jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered against his cheek. If Volkov didn't have the drive, and Jenkins had only tried to move the cash, where was the ledger? "Boss," Leo interrupted, stepping forward with a ringing, encrypted satellite phone. "It's our cyber division. They intercepted a heavily encrypted data packet trying to bounce off our private servers to a proxy in Moscow. Someone on our inside is trying to sell the ledger back to Volkov." Victor froze. The temperature in the warehouse seemed to plummet an additional 10 degrees. Betrayal within the Marino syndicate was not just rare. It was historically a death sentence. "Who?" Victor demanded, his eyes narrowing into pitch-black slits. Leo looked uncharacteristically pale. "It's Carmine. He was running point on the precinct cleanup last night. He must have found the drive on Jenkins before internal affairs got there, pocketed it, and kept his mouth shut." "Carmine. one of Victor's most trusted captains. The revelation hit him with the force of a freight train, but it quickly morphed into blinding, calculating rage. If Carmine had the ledger, he was no longer just a traitor. He was an active liability. And worse, Carmine knew exactly where Victor kept the most precious thing in his world. "Put a bullet in Dimitri," Victor ordered coldly, already turning on his heel and striding toward the warehouse exit. "And mobilize every man we have. We need to get back to the penthouse, now." When the biometric locks on the penthouse elevator clicked open an hour later, Chloe practically ran to the foyer. Victor stepped out, looking exhausted and severely dangerous. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of his tattoos. There were faint spatters of crimson on his French cuffs. "Victor," Chloe breathed, her heart lurching. Without thinking, she threw her heavy body against his chest, her thick arms wrapping tightly around his broad shoulders. Victor let out a shuddering breath, his arms instantly locking around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet, clean scent of her skin. In her arms, the violent monster he had to be for the world melted away. "I've got you," he whispered fiercely, his hand sliding down to grip her wide hips. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "We have a problem. The ledger that caused all of this. It was stolen by one of my own men. A captain named Carmine. He's trying to sell the secrets back to the Russians." Chloe's eyes widened in horror. "Your own men? Victor, what does that mean?" "It means the war just came inside my own house," Victor said darkly. He brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his gaze dropping to her full, trembling lips. "But I will burn the entire city before I let anyone near you." Unable to resist any longer, Victor leaned down and captured her mouth. The kiss was desperate, bruising, and deeply possessive. Chloe whimpered, melting into him, her hands tangling in his dark hair. For a woman who had spent her life feeling entirely invisible, the sheer magnitude of his desire was intoxicating. He kissed her like she was oxygen, his hands roaming over her soft, substantial curves with absolute reverence. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "I have to leave again tonight to hunt Carmine down, but Dominic has 20 heavily armed men stationed around this building. You are safe here." The neon skyline of Chicago flickered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, distorted shadows across the dark walnut floors. It was 11:45 p.m. Victor had been gone for 4 hours, hunting a ghost in a city that knew how to keep its secrets. Chloe sat in the master suite, curled up in a massive leather armchair, a thick cashmere throw blanket draped over her legs. She couldn't sleep. The phantom pain of the plastic zip ties still ached in her wrists, a sharp reminder of how violently her life had been derailed in a matter of 24 hours. She was a fat, exhausted waitress who suddenly found herself at the center of a multi-million-dollar blood feud. Out in the main living area, the atmosphere was deadly quiet. Dominic had stationed himself by the primary elevator, while 2 other guards patrolled the perimeter corridors. Security was absolute. The building was impenetrable, until the lights abruptly cut out. The penthouse plunged into pitch darkness. The low hum of the central air conditioning died instantly. A second later, the red glow of emergency backup lights flickered on, casting an eerie, bloody hue over the luxurious apartment. Chloe's breath hitched in her throat. She stood up slowly, the cashmere blanket sliding off her lap. "Dominic," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. A heavy, suffocating dread settled into her chest. She crept toward the heavy oak door of the master suite, pressing her ear against the wood. She heard the distinct, muffled thwip of a suppressed gunshot, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Panic, raw and paralyzing, seized her. Carmine wasn't hiding from Victor. He had used the distraction to bypass the building's grid, slipping through the service shafts to strike at Victor's only vulnerability. Her. The doorknob to the master suite rattled violently. It was locked from the inside, but the heavy steel deadbolt groaned under a massive impact. Someone was kicking the door in. Chloe's survival instinct, honed by years of navigating a hostile world that constantly tried to push her down, finally snapped awake. She wasn't a fragile, delicate woman. She had weight. She had power. She looked frantically around the room and grabbed the heaviest object she could lift, a solid bronze sculpture resting on a mahogany side table. It easily weighed 20 pounds, but adrenaline surged through her thick arms, making it feel entirely manageable. She positioned herself behind the heavy oak door, pressing her broad back against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. With a deafening crack, the door frame splintered. The heavy oak swung inward, slamming against the wall just inches from Chloe's face. A man stepped into the room, holding a suppressed tactical pistol. Carmine was tall, wire-thin, and possessed the desperate, feral eyes of a man who knew he was a dead man walking. He swept the room with his weapon, his gaze locking onto the empty bed. "Want to talk? Come out, piggy," Carmine sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "I just need a hostage to get out of the city. Make it easy on yourself." He took 2 steps further into the suite, his back entirely exposed to the corner where Chloe stood. With a guttural yell, Chloe swung the bronze sculpture with every ounce of force in her 240-pound frame. The heavy metal connected solidly with the back of Carmine's skull with a sickening crunch. Carmine let out a sharp cry, dropping the gun as he staggered forward, but the blow wasn't enough to knock him out. He spun around, blood streaming down his neck, his eyes wide with shocked fury. He lunged at her, his hands clawing for her throat. Chloe didn't retreat. She dropped the statue and used her sheer mass. She tackled him mid-lunge, driving her heavy shoulder straight into his chest. The impact lifted Carmine off his feet, and they both crashed into the glass coffee table, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. They wrestled violently on the floor. Carmine was a trained killer, but he was light, and Chloe's weight pinned him down securely. He punched her hard in the ribs, the blow stealing her breath, but she refused to let him reach the dropped pistol. She threw her thick forearms across his throat, pressing down with her entire upper body. "Get off me!" Carmine choked, thrashing wildly beneath her. Suddenly, the shattered remnants of the penthouse doors burst completely open. The beam of high-powered tactical flashlights sliced through the emergency red lighting. "Chloe!" Victor Marino's voice was a roar of pure, unfiltered terror. He stormed into the master suite, Leo hot on his heels. Victor took in the scene in a fraction of a second. He saw Dominic bleeding but alive in the hallway, and then he saw his woman, bruised, bleeding from a cut on her cheek, pinning his traitorous captain to the floor amidst the shattered glass. "Get away from her!" Victor snarled, his voice dropping to a demonic register. Chloe scrambled backward, her chest heaving, tears finally spilling down her face as the adrenaline began to crash. Victor didn't even use his gun. He grabbed Carmine by the collar of his tactical vest, hauling the bleeding man off the floor with monstrous strength, and slammed his fist into Carmine's face with a sickening snap. Carmine went entirely limp, unconscious before he hit the ground. "Leo, take him!" Victor ordered, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Leo dragged the traitor out of the room, leaving Victor and Chloe alone in the ruined suite. Victor dropped to his knees amid the broken glass, ignoring the shards biting into his suit pants. He pulled Chloe roughly into his arms, burying his face against her large, soft breasts, his entire body trembling violently. "I'm sorry," Victor choked out, the ruthless mafia don completely breaking down in the arms of his curvy waitress. "I almost lost you. My God, Chloe, I almost lost you." She wrapped her thick arms around his neck, holding him tightly as he clung to her. "I'm okay, Victor. I'm okay." Victor pulled back, his dark eyes ablaze with a terrifying, absolute resolve. He pressed a kiss to her bleeding cheek, tasting salt and copper. "He touched you," Victor whispered, his voice cold as the grave. "Grigory Volkov ordered this hit. He put you in danger. Tonight the Russian syndicate ends. Completely." The storm finally broke just as the sun crested over the Chicago skyline, casting long, golden rays across the rain-slicked streets. But 30 miles north, inside the heavily fortified Highland Park estate of Grigory Volkov, a different kind of storm was just making landfall. Victor Marino did not send a crew to do his dirty work. He led the assault himself. The betrayal by Carmine had cut close, but the threat to Chloe had severed whatever mercy remained in Victor's soul. He would not sleep, nor would he find peace, until the men who had terrified his woman were buried beneath the weight of their own greed. Dressed in a pristine black tactical suit, Victor moved through the opulent corridors of the Russian compound with the terrifying, silent precision of a ghost. Leo and a dozen of the Marino Syndicate's most lethal operatives flanked him, their movements perfectly synchronized as they swept through the mansion room by room. The Russian guards, arrogant and hungover from a night of celebrating what they assumed was Carmine's successful assassination attempt, never stood a chance. The resistance was dismantled systematically, quietly, and with absolute prejudice. Every step Victor took was fueled by the memory of Chloe pinned against that alley wall, the red welts on her wrists, and the heavy, terrifying thud of the bronze statue she had been forced to use to defend her own life in his penthouse. Victor kicked open the heavy mahogany doors to Volkov's private study. The room smelled intensely of expensive cigars, leather, and cheap, harsh vodka. Grigory Volkov, a massive man with a thick grey beard and a chest like a barrel, scrambled backward behind his massive oak desk. His panicked, trembling hands frantically searched for the gold-plated revolver he kept hidden in his top drawer. He never reached it. Leo's suppressed rifle barked once, a sharp, mechanical sound that shattered Volkov's wrist instantly. The Russian boss screamed in agony, collapsing heavily into his leather executive chair and clutching his mangled arm to his chest, blood dripping onto the Persian rug. Victor walked slowly into the room, his heavy combat boots crunching over the shattered glass of a dropped decanter. He stopped directly in front of the desk, staring down at the man who had ordered a hit on the only light in his dark, violent world. "Marino," Volkov gasped, his face completely pale, cold sweat beading on his forehead. "You are breaking the syndicate truce. The commission will have your head for this. You cannot just walk into my home." "The commission works for me," Victor replied, his voice an icy, hollow void that promised nothing but destruction. He reached into his tactical vest and tossed the digital ledger, the very drive Carmine had tried to sell, onto the desk. It clattered loudly against the polished wood. "You tried to buy my secrets from a traitor. I could have forgiven that. It is the nature of our business. But you crossed a line, Grigory. You ordered your dogs to torture Dinah, to raid an apartment, and to terrorize an innocent woman. You sent a killer into my home to put his hands on what is mine. She was a nobody, Volkov spat, his excruciating pain making him entirely reckless. A fat, useless waitress who got in the way of $3 million. You are starting a full-scale war over a piece of heavy trash. Victor's eyes went completely dead. He didn't yell. He didn't sneer. He simply drew his weapon, leveled it directly at Volkov's forehead, and spoke with terrifying, unyielding finality. She is my queen, and your empire ends today. The gunshot echoed violently through the sprawling estate, signaling the absolute end of the Russian syndicate in Chicago. Victor turned on his heel, not bothering to look at the defeated man. "Burn it down," he ordered Leo without missing a beat. "Leave nothing but ashes." 3 weeks later, the crisp autumn air swept through the bustling streets of the affluent Gold Coast, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and lake water. Inside the newly opened Dempsey's Bakery and Community Kitchen, the warm, intoxicating aroma of fresh sourdough, melted butter, and sweet cherry pie filled the air, acting as a beacon for the neighborhood. Chloe stood behind the gleaming marble counter, laughing loudly as she handed a fresh pastry to a young child from the neighborhood. She looked utterly radiant. She wore a tailored, soft lavender wrap dress that hugged her wide hips, accentuated her full bust, and draped elegantly over her heavy stomach. A pristine white apron was tied around her waist. The dark circles under her eyes were completely gone, replaced by a vibrant, confident glow. She was no longer the exhausted, invisible woman struggling to survive on minimum wage, hiding her large body from the world. She was the proud owner of a thriving business, the heart of the community, fully funded, unapologetically taking up space, and fiercely protected by the most powerful man in the city. The brass bell above the glass door chimed, and the chaotic, happy chatter of the bakery instantly hushed. A collective stillness fell over the patrons as the door opened. Victor stepped inside. He was dressed in a flawless navy bespoke suit, exuding an aura of immense power and wealth that made the other customers instinctively step aside to clear a path. He didn't look at any of them. His dark, intense gaze was locked entirely on Chloe, his eyes softening the moment they landed on her. A brilliant, breathtaking smile broke across Chloe's round face. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on a towel and walked out from behind the counter, her thick thighs brushing against the soft fabric of her lavender dress. She didn't hesitate. She walked right up to the feared Mafia Don, stepping into his space with absolute confidence, and wrapped her thick arms around his neck. Victor's hard, unyielding expression melted the second he touched her. He wrapped his large hands around her thick waist, pulling her substantial, soft curves flush against his hard, muscular frame. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply, grounding himself in her warmth after a long day of dealing with the city's grim realities. "You're early," Chloe whispered, her heart fluttering, just as it had the very first night he walked into O'Malley's diner. "I couldn't stay away another second," Victor murmured, his lips brushing gently against her jawline, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. "The boardroom is entirely too dull without you, in my view." He pulled back slightly, his thumbs tracing the soft, generous swell of her hips. He looked at her with a level of worship and absolute adoration that still took her breath away. To the world, he was a ruthless monster. But to her, he was an absolute sanctuary. "Are you ready to go home, Mia Regina?" Victor asked, his voice a low, possessive rumble. Chloe looked around the bustling bakery, a beautiful dream she thought she would never achieve, made real by the man who had ripped apart the city's underworld to keep her safe. She looked back into Victor's eyes, seeing nothing but endless devotion. "Yes," Chloe smiled, leaning up to capture his lips in a slow, deep kiss that sealed their new beginning. "Take me home, Victor." Did you love this thrilling conclusion to Chloe and Victor's story? From a terrifying arrest over a stale loaf of bread to becoming the undisputed queen of the Chicago underworld, Chloe proved that true strength comes in all shapes and sizes. If this gripping mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance lovers and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, drama-filled stories.